Hello, welcome back from lunch. Hope you enjoyed. So now we will continue with the topic of artificial intelligence. So one question for you: do you maybe drive differently if the voice of your navigation system is male or female, or it doesn't matter to you? It matters? It does or it doesn't? It does not. Okay. To repeat the question, okay, do you drive differently if the voice of your navigation system is male or female? I don't drive. You don't drive? Okay, that's also acceptable answer. So I will now call Feja, our moderator for next session. Welcome.
It works, okay. Okay, hello. It's nice to be here in this new venue for the point, to make a point here about navigational and AIs in general, our Pilates and Lukáš, because they're really interesting and I don't want to occupy their space. We have 45 minutes, so whoever starts first.
Thank you, Feda. So we want to welcome you. Thank you for coming. We know we are in competition with lunch, so we cherish that all of you who are now here have made it. And now I hand over to Lukáš.
Hey, everybody. Thanks again so much for coming and not falling asleep after lunch yet. In order to really discover the story of humanity's interaction with technology, let's do a trip back to the 70s. Where Ali Russell Hochschild, a sociologist, came up with a theory called emotional labor. Now, the best way to describe emotional labor is that it's sort of the difference between, let's say, a fireman and a teacher and a therapist, let's say. Like, if you're a fireman, your job is to put out fires. It doesn't really depend on your emotional state at the time. You could be happy, you could be sad, you could be angry, you could be ecstatic, you could be disappointed. It doesn't matter. What matters in your job is your ability to put out fires. On the other hand, if you're a teacher or a therapist, your emotions are your job. If your students are happy, you smile with them. If your students are angry, you mourn with them. If your patient shares you something great, you celebrate with them. Essentially, jobs that force us to project our emotions outwards and not to adjust our emotions to the situation. Sorry, not to adjust, but instead to force ourselves with a new emotional response, depending on the situation. Those are those that take on emotional labor. And it's not just teachers or firemen. A very good example that Ali Hochschild Russell described was fancy airplanes. So in the 70s, air travel was seen as this huge and immensely glamorous thing, right? Like you travel, they give you champagne, you go on a super fast plane, you pay a shed load of money, and it takes you across the Atlantic in just a few hours. But along with this, there was something else. It wasn't just about the product of travel. It was about a certain personality, a certain even gendered personality. Because the air crew ended up sort of assuming the personality of almost quasi-moms to very spoiled businessmen. And yes, most of the time they were very much men. Essentially, what was happening was that the air crew was taking on not their own personalities. They weren't happy or angry or sad or ecstatic. Instead, they were taking on a corporate personality that had to eclipse their own feelings in order to give the customers what they wanted as a personality. By now, you're probably scared that I've tricked you all into a sociology lecture with nothing about tech. Worry not, because we've jumped to tech. Because it's not just human personalities that we're talking about here. I shall not destroy the stage, I promise. Over the past couple of months, I've spent a lot of time conversing with Siri. Hey Siri, open the pod bay doors. Anyone get the reference? Okay. It's from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And Siri was sort of programmed to have lots of responses. My favorite one, which I couldn't screenshot, was, "But the cat will get out." And similarly, Siri says, "Say pretty, please." "Hey Siri, what does your name mean?" Siri cannot explain it in my language. And Siri is unwilling to provide data about its age either. Now, the interesting thing is that in all of those cases, Siri is not just a simple program that gives you data, facts, and cold things. Siri is an emotion, Siri is a personality, Siri is a feeling. Just like there was the feeling with sort of aircrew, that there was a certain sense of glamour that everybody's personalities in the aircrew business were supposed to accede to, so too Siri has a very, very strong corporate personality in which we could argue gender has quite a big effect. So now psychological research does kind of suggest that we tend to assign tasks with high emotional labor to women. For example, majority of therapists are women, majority of teachers are women. We could go into a sort of feminist sociology lecture, but if anything, we'll need to jump into the questions for this, because unfortunately our time is a bit limited, even though we could speak about this for hours. But like, no, in all seriousness, people are starting to treat Siri as a quasi-therapist at times. We talk to Siri about our dreams, we talk to Siri about our hopes, we talk to Siri about our sadnesses. I've also told Siri about 100 times, for research purposes, that I've broken up with a significant other, and first Siri was responding like, "Don't worry, there's plenty of fish in the sea, 32,467 species in fact." After a while, Siri got tired and started responding with, "I don't know how to respond to this." So yes, I wore out Siri emotionally. So this is really our big question, like how does the gendering of digital assistants affect our emotional interactions with them? Like, are we more likely to attempt, for example, a deep emotional relationship with a digital assistant that's gendered feminine or not? Are we more likely to treat feminine Siri, as is the default in the US, as our de facto assistant or as our sort of de facto therapist than we are to treat male gendered Siri? I mean, it's an open question. We're still in the process of, thinking this through and collecting the data, but this is the thing that's been on our mind for the previous couple of months.
And not only for the last couple of months. Now we're doing a small historical digression. What you see behind me is a screenshot of a program called Eliza. Eliza was one of the first chatbots that were created, and this one was created by Joseph Weizenbaum in 1966, who is then, at the time, computer science professor at MIT. And Eliza is a chatbot that acts in a quasi-therapist manner, in mimicking a style of therapy called Rogerian psychotherapy. He chose to do it that way because often when you see people interacting with chatbots, then trying to test them if they're real or if they have like a knowledge about the world, asking like, "Hey, how's the weather at the place where you're staying?" And Weizenbaum chose exactly this form because a therapist doesn't have to show that they have knowledge about the world. If you come to Eliza and you say, like, "Hey, I was on a boat trip with my mom," and Eliza, or in this case, like the therapist role, says, "Oh, so tell me more about boats." We don't assume that the therapist doesn't know anything about boats, but we know that this is a psychotherapist technique. The interesting thing is, and Eliza as a case study, is that the way that Weizenbaum intended it to didn't quite resonate with how people received it. Weizenbaum wrote this chatbot to illustrate how a computer could never be a human dialogue partner, like on one level. But what actually happened is that people took it for real. People said, took it seriously and talked with it about their problems. There was one event where Weizenbaum went into his office, and his secretary told him that he could maybe go out for a moment because she was confiding secrets about her marriage with the Eliza program. Nope, that was the wrong way. And this is a very interesting case study because from this, the so-called Eliza effect was then studied. The Eliza effect is the effect that humans attribute human qualities to a machine, like when it responds in these kinds of interaction, even in cases where humans know that the machine gives back deterministic output. And another short note, why does Eliza actually has a female name? I mean, it could have been Roger or Jack, but Weizenbaum chose the name Eliza based on a drama by George Bernard Shaw called Pygmalion. Just to wrap it up short, in Pygmalion, a phonetics professor meets a young working class girl, and he makes a bet with a friend that he can go to a dinner party and present her as a noblewoman just by teaching her how to speak in a proper posh manner. And then in the end he succeeds, but not because she actually is a noblewoman, but people perceive her as one, take her to be one. And exactly the same thing happens back there with Eliza. She isn't a psychotherapist who actually is on the other side and cares for what you say and tries to help you solve your problems. But Eliza is what people make of her. And here we come into a very weird realm where our perception shifts from perceiving these devices as objects, going into bordering into perceiving them as subjects, even though sometimes we know that they aren't. Looking at these three suspects, I mean, this kind of projection also takes place in the way that we view Alexa, Siri, or other digital assistants. But what I would say is also important when talking about these, the picture that we have of these devices is not only shaped by the way that we interact with them, but also, of course, by their media representation. I see the way that they're marketed contributes as framing them as personalities, as assistants, even though we really have to focus on that these are products. And their marketing tries to suggest us that there's some kind of personality behind us. But there really isn't, because they're designed in a way to appear to us the most, to be affirming and to react in exactly the way that we want it. Of course, now people could say, yeah, but like I like Siri's voice. Like I like that it sounds feminine and nice. And to that, I researched findings by former professor of communication Clifford Nass, who was at Stanford, who researched how voice interfaces can work for computer systems. And he found that people tend to perceive female voices as helping us to solve our problems by ourselves, while they view male voices as authority figures who tell us the answers to our problems. Now, again, it would be interesting to know your experience about how you drive differently if your navigational system has a male or female voice. Again, to the study, I have to say that, and we don't have to agree on that necessarily, that the way that people perceive these voices is not necessarily something that is inherent to femaleness or maleness, but it rather reflects the way that society expects men or women to act. And I see a parallel to what we have described before with emotional labor, that in designing these digital assistants in a feminine way, being agreeable, being serviceable, there's kind of a parallel expectation to the way that we also expect female service workers to behave. But. Now, Judith Butler, a theorist who works in the field of gender studies, might say, and that's for a short side note to the way that we use these terms, when we talk of female voices or female assistants, that gender is nothing that is really inherent into that. It's not an essential quality, but rather, just as in humans, gender is something that we do. It's something that results from the performance of masculinity or femininity that we do. And that's not something that she said, but I think what we came to in our research for this talk is that also machines like Siri, Alexa, and Eliza, they also participate in that performance of femininity and in turn contribute to the overall representation of femininity.
YouTube and the internets are filled with really funny videos of kids trying to interact with digital assistants and failing. So, but this is actually a much more important topic than we think it is, because we are all adults in the room, and for us, maybe, well, most of us, figuring out the difference between sort of machines and human beings might be a relatively easy task. But digital assistants are finding their way more and more into households and being used more and more by the youngest members of our society. So I'd just love to talk a bit more about what is it actually like to grow up with digital assistants in the house. Like, there's lots and lots of debates and discussions about this. There was a super cool piece recently on should you say please and thank you to Siri? Like, of course I do, because I want to survive the robot revolution. But some people would argue, no, you shouldn't say please and thank you to Siri, Alexa, Google Home systems, etc. Precisely in order to sort of better understand that this is a machine and not a human being, and that you need to have different emotional sort of reactions with machines and human beings. So telling children whether or not to say please and thank you to Siri and Alexa is actually a really profound sort of philosophical and psychological discussion. It's much less trivial than it might seem at first. Not only this, but if there's one thing that kids are good at, it's emotional blackmail. And if there's one thing that digital assistants are good at, is resisting emotional blackmail. Slate article about growing up with digital assistants had this beautiful quote that Alexa's relentlessly honest about what she can and cannot provide and impervious to emotional outbursts. I envy her. So yeah, like there is something very profoundly weird about the fact that, if a kid were to ask me 20 times if they can, I don't know, play some sort of annoying pop song or have chocolate for dinner, most adults would probably get pretty annoyed at the 20th time. Most adults are very vulnerable to kids, crying and screaming and in general trying to, use the emotional manipulation techniques that kids are prone to using. On the other hand, digital assistants really don't care if you start crying or if you ask them the same question 20 times in a row. Once again, sort of introducing digital assistants at such an early stage that precisely when, let's say, kids, especially toddlers, are sort of testing the emotional limits of human and non-human interaction is something that's fascinating, dangerous, and probably requires a lot more thinking than we're giving it right now. So, like, what do digital assistants teach our children? What do the personalities teach our children? Are we telling people to learn how best to interact with sort of corporate-derived emotional personalities, sort of, corporate personalities, both like we've seen in airlines and as we've seen in Siri? Not to mention that the gender aspects are probably kind of troubling if we teach our kids from a very early age that the feminine default voice is the one that you talk to when you want to order food or turn off the lights or even talk about your feelings. All of those things that, digital assistants have. And it also teaches us about, all the things that emotional assistants, that was a very good slip, digital assistants don't have. So this is in itself probably very deeply problematic, and it kind of freaks me out that we aren't talking about this enough. Not only this, but Alexa looks friendly. Like, it looks cute. It looks like a little rat on wheels, like a doggy, like a puppy. And this is why there was this really interesting comment as well, that there's something disturbing about Alexa, that within a few years, children will be fully trained to live with a surveillance device. Because that's what those tools are right now. Like, they are little things that take your data, save it to the cloud. They're being used to train machine learning algorithms. Behind cute personalities and weird emotional interactions, they teach us to fundamentally be okay with very large-scale data interactions. Essentially, the personalities in themselves are so friendly that they actually alienate us from sort of all the weird technical stuff that goes on in the background, much of which is probably not particularly good for us or for our privacy. So the lessons that we are imparting by rolling out digital assistants everywhere are kind of terrifying. let's jump very quickly to human bias and algorithmic bias. So usually when I teach slightly about algorithmic bias, I put up a picture like this. This used to be a jellyfish. It's been redone by an algorithm, probably trained on pictures of puppies and birds and stuff. So the algorithm sees puppies everywhere it goes. So it looks at a jellyfish and it's like, yay, puppy. It's a bit like a 2-year-old who's learned only the word dog and points at cows and horses and calls them dogs. Like, it's the same process. The only things that algorithms know are the things that we have taught them. So, humans generate bad data. Humans are racist, sexist, discriminatory in all sorts of weird and terrifying ways. And algorithms learn this discrimination for us. And one of the most terrifying things about our own biases is that unless we are directly and personally confronted by them, it's fiendishly difficult for us to see and realize our own biases, which is one of the many, many ways the bias is almost impossible to spot, almost impossible to measure with the data collection methods that we have right now. So machines are learning from us, and we're having huge trouble in unlearning machine bias, precisely because we have no idea how to measure things like bias in the first place. This is bad. But there's hope. Like, what if this could change? Like, what if machines could make us aware of our own biases? And I think that there is huge potential here as well. Like, what if digital assistants like Siri could do A/B testing? And let's say, half of the time they present a masculine voice, half of the time they present a feminine voice, and they start to actually measure. They start to actually measure how our reactions and interactions with them work. What if digital assistants could, randomly select one of 10 personalities on the day, and then, collect our voice data, collect our tone of voice data, collect data about our vocabulary, and based on this, actually teach us about our own biases. Like, I think that digital assistants offer such a huge, immense, and wonderful opportunity for us to finally collect data about our own biases in a way that we've never managed to collect before. And I think that this is something that's really cool, could have a lot of potential, and I hope that we as a society push for this in the future. Like, there has been a big precedent already. So, 5 or 10 years ago, the game of Go was considered unwinnable for computers. Like, trust me, there's even an XKCD on how unwinnable the game of Go was for computers. And then Google's AlphaGo team beat it using machine learning. Now, the interesting thing about Google's AlphaGo algorithms was that they took moves that were completely unpredictable, moves that were in many ways described as creative. I'm not going to get into discussion on what is creativity and what isn't in an age of machines, but I'm sure that it's a whole different can of worms. It was so creative that one of the commentators described one of the moves made by AlphaGo as, it's not a human move, it's beautiful. And now sort of Lee Sedol, who was beaten by AlphaGo, and he was the reigning Go champion before that, has been learning from the program as well and improving his own style of play and sort of figuring out gaps in his thinking that the machine has managed to show him. So I think that there is already a huge and fascinating historical precedent for how we can learn from machines and what machines can teach us. So we think that there's no reason whatsoever for digital assistants not to do the same. So yes, we could have a digital assistant that would do the same and sort of, point it out to you.
Hey Dave, you spoke to me differently when I had a male voice. Not the equipment. Point won't invite us if we break this again. So, yeah, now that Lukas has taken care of all the buzzwords, thank you. I would say this is an interesting vision, but there are definitely caveats to this. As said before, associating machines that we mostly use for emotional labor with femininity, in my point of view, repeats patterns that we already have out there in the world of unjust, or of how certain productive and reproductive labor is unjustly distributed over the population and also gendered and therefore packed into expectations. And moreover, more on the technological side, as pointed out before, these personalities that are presented to us are all fictions, corporate fantasies, if you will. These are not made to be our friends or our therapists or our companions, but all of the devices that we have talked about are commercial products that are sold to us and are marketed towards us with this goal of being affirming and serviceable. And in the face of the vision that Lukáš has illustrated for us, that we could maybe use this to find out more about us, to gain a way of introspection into our own biases and views of the world, these devices store a lot of extremely personal and intimate data. And as the software that is running on these devices and the infrastructures in which they run, which is proprietary and closed and uses our data to sell us, I would be really aware to make Alexa and Siri more human-like and more trustable if we are then growing up and living in environments together with these surveillance devices.
I mean, and this is sort of a much, much wider discussion that we've been having for a while already, because recently, sort of, even last week, Google announced that it sort of got down its voice recognition algorithms to 2.5 gigabytes, which essentially means that we could soon actually have like full, proper working voice recognition on our own devices, which I think opens up the opportunity in, let's say, 5 years of us having digital devices that are no longer dependent on the cloud, but actually that work for us. I think that that's a very realistic vision.
But I see, on the technological side, that's already an advance if the system runs locally. But still, if the algorithms aren't open and we have no way of verifying what happens to our data, and there's no kind of accountability, and we have no agency in what happens about the information that is stored about us, that still remains a problem.
I mean, I think that sort of creating an open source one within the next 5 to 10 years shouldn't be too much of a technological challenge, should we?
Well, I mean, then we need funding for that, and you have to push it.
Ooh. So, crowdfunding, raise your hands. Nobody?
I want one. But also, coming back to the gender topic, I think it's still also a question, do these devices have to be human-like in order for us to trust them? Because then, again, the Eliza effect sets in. And to me, that really is a question, if that is not an inhibitor of us having a responsible relationship to technology.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge, huge discussion for me, and I think that, sort of the history of humanity has been the history of us freaking out about technology. Like, the history of writing and print has started off with Socrates being like, kids those days, they will never remember anything because they can just read it in the books. I mean, for me, technology can only move as quickly as sort of social progress allows it to, right? Like, Google Glass never took off and the Apple Watch took off precisely because Google Glass never caught up with social norms. Like, Google Glass looked weird and dorky, and you didn't know if someone was looking at a screen or interacting with you. So I think that sort of social norms are almost slowing down the progress of technology.
I really wouldn't go all the way with that, because then I think we don't focus on how technology also is shaping social norms and social interactions. Because like when the internet started and we had these TCP and IP protocols and all of the communication that started then, that did in quite a way, like, I like how Cory Doctorow frames it, like that the internet really lowers the cost of cooperation. And I think that's a good counter-argument to what you say, is that technology does impact social structures and social hierarchies.
No, completely. Like, technology impacts us, technology shapes society, we shape society, but I think that sort of, like, humanity's interaction with technology is one of sort of constant weird panic and anxiety. Like, one of my favorite quotes about humanity and technology comes from Walter Ong, who essentially said that, technology is artificial, but artificiality is natural to human beings. Like, the human experience is to literally have a constant existential crisis with the world and technologies we've been creating. So, yeah, existential crisis.
I think that's a good closing.
I guess I have the mic.
So I was listening to you, and it's all about psychology, about emotions. So since I'm a sort of a whatever, a geek or a nerd, I don't know what I am. Essentially, I'm a librarian. So when you were talking about what we expect from females and males in the sense of voice, that someone tells us how to solve a problem or to help us to solve a problem, then it came to me that most of the librarians are women, at least in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they do help us in both ways, but it's how do we recognize them. So, and on the other side, there's a lot there, for me, a lot of references to pop culture popped out from even the Alexas. When Alexa appeared, then in one of the sitcoms, there was this relationship of a woman
With Raj?
and a machine.
Like the scene with Raj in The Big Bang Theory?
It's not similar to that, but this is about like divorcees, and this lady is a lawyer, and she can't find anyone, and blah blah. So she gets a present, Alexa for a present. It's a male voice, and then it's kind of a comical version of her, Quaron's her. But for me, what I've told you already about is that, like, for male voices, because of pop culture, in my case at least, or anyone who likes sci-fi, tend to raise anxiety because I think someone wants to kill me, like HAL 9000. While on the other side, most of these AIs have kind of female voices, even though you can change them. The thing is, why we don't change them? That's the issue. I mean, I'm asking both.
Yeah. I'm sorry if you feel that male voices around you are plotting to kill you. I'm feeling quite comfortable with you and the people who.
No, I'm telling you to say technology.
I know,
when it has a male voice.
Yeah. I wouldn't, like, a counter-argument against that I would pose is that if you look at digital assistants that are used in finance or in law, that what I see is that they are proportionally more often have a male voice or a neutral one. So I do see a certain proportion of, or a certain dependence on how a device is gendered according in which field you use it.
So if they offer us like financial device, then they have a male or at best case androgynous voice, and in like these emotional stuff, as you said, as I understood, they usually have female voices. And I'm asking both because you both talked about it.
I mean, one of the really interesting things for me sort of is to think about sort of the market dynamics that underlie this, okay? So on the one hand, the market dynamics are asking us to do things that are in line with our biases, right? Like, in general, markets encourage us to go down our biases. We see advertising that sort of targets our biases. We see machines that make us feel good about ourselves and therefore target our biases because contradicting our biases is a pretty uncomfortable process, okay? At the same time, I think that markets could be encouraging the completely opposite thing as well, okay? Like, I think that companies, for example, are investing huge sums right now into figuring out how to beat back hidden biases, figuring out how to, increase corporate diversity. Whether those programs are effective or not is up to debate, but I think that this suggests that sort of the market is moving towards an era in which machines could be forcing us to confront our own biases rather than play into them. So I think that once once the discussion of machines and biases becomes more and more widespread, we could start seeing completely different market mechanisms in which we have machines that consciously force us to confront our biases. If market demand for diversity and for confronting our biases continues to exist, which I very much hope it does.
But like I said, most of the voice recognition softwares except Cortana or Alexa has kind of like Siri is, you can say it's a female or male in a sense. I don't know why we perceive it as a female. But they have an option to change the voice. Why don't we change the voice? Is it because of what you're saying that we just tend to oblige to our biases?
I think I would go down that lane. That is the more familiar association, and that that's why people might stick to that. And I think it could be helpful to think out of the box. That not think, okay, like, will I switch my voice assistant to a masculine voice or to a feminine voice, but also trying to think beyond that. I've heard of a project, I think it's called Q, of a voice for digital assistants, which is a remastering of a lot of voice samples from different people. That also has like a bass frequency that is in between what we associate as clearly feminine or clearly masculine.
And then comes our bias about race and so on and so forth, and we can discuss, because there's also an issue of voices related to different races, how their pitch is different, is it deep or high and so on, regardless of gender. So in that sense, I agree with you, we should challenge our biases, not only in terms of voice recognition or voice assistance, but also search in algorithm in general, because algorithms are full of our biases. And is it the first step that we recognize that machines are imperfect because they were created by imperfect, or have been created by imperfect beings?
I mean, yeah.
Definitely.
And one more thing that I would add is that it's incredibly difficult to actually measure bias, and nobody's really come up with a sort of reliable psychological predictor for how biased we are as a society. So there is like a Harvard implicit bias test. I don't remember the exact name, but it's been very much critiqued by a lot of psychologists. Like, there is no current sort of psychological or sociological method to say that, I don't know, our society is 2 points too biased towards a certain movement or something. It hasn't happened yet. We haven't figured out the measurement mechanisms yet. I'm kind of utopian in the sense in that I very much hope that interactions with machines and A/B testing could help us understand this better and confront it. But there hasn't really been any successful attempt in psychology or sociology to actually quantify or measure bias.
I have the impression that we're circling around this one topic. From the audience, is there any other questions that we haven't touched on yet? Hands.
Testing 1, 2. Okay. So it's Project Implicit, the one that you mentioned, that measures implicit bias from Harvard, and it's interesting. The question is, you went through a lot of these things, that how people react to female voices and male voices, and what to expect from a female or male voice, and you made this point several times that we should be aware that these are machines, not personalities. We shouldn't expect emotional feedback from them, shouldn't treat them as personalities, etc. So what would be the specific thing to do to depersonalize a voice? Because it does speak to you. It needs to have a certain intonation. You can make like a robotic voice, it's probably going to sound male in the end if you do the robotic voice, you know, the classical, like, you know, straight, flat voice that does not go either up or down. So how do you, like, if you call it a corporate fantasy, what would a corporation do to make a non-manipulative voice that wouldn't go either way or be presented in any of these, you know, prisms that you went through in your presentation? Or is someone already doing that? I don't know.
I would say like that there is no easy answer to that, because it is a very complex process what happens in the brain in acoustic phonetics when we hear a voice. Because the only thing that I know about, which I could maybe point out in this, is that we use machine learning on a very broad data set, that we collect a lot of voice samples from people with different basic frequencies, with different intonation patterns, also of different ages, and maybe try to run a machine learning algorithm on that, to try and mix that up and pull from a diverse data set. And one project that I know works into that direction is by the Mozilla Foundation. They have the so-called Common Voice project, where people can donate their voices to create a more diverse data set, and also people can are encouraged to label certain all the donations, so that not even the voices get more diverse, but also the range of speakers to which these systems correspond gets broader. Because there have been studies that show that older people are less well understood by these devices because they have been trained on voice data by a significantly younger audience.
I had a very technical question, like how is ELIZA effect different from the Turing test? Like, is it almost the same thing, if you know what I mean? Like,
I would say the difference is that the tester, and the human tester, knows beforehand which kind that this program or this dialogue partner is a program, and also the objective of this test is not to find out or to discover the identity of your dialogue partner, but is rather to, as far as I understood, just to open up and try to engage in this therapeutic conversation.
that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Any more questions? I guess no.
I have one more anecdote maybe to tell.
Okay.
Because you mentioned the Turing test, I had a very interesting discussion in preparation for this with a woman who had actually looked at the original paper by Alan Turing. I think it's called on computing and machinery, and where like this so-called Turing test is described, which he doesn't call the Turing test, and just in reception to that paper, it was called the so-called Turing test. And interestingly, in this original layout, this test is not really about machines, but it's like a deception test. Like you have one interview partner who talks to two people. One of them is a man and one of them is a woman. And they converse ideally by text. Like they write on a letter and then they slip it maybe under a door. And the interview partner has to find out and can ask questions. Who of them is the woman? And there are two rules extra to that, is that the woman is advised that she should just be authentic, just write the way that she usually does. And the man who is advised that he should persuade the interviewer that he is actually the woman. And he can also like accuse the other conversation partner and say, yeah, no, she, that's the imposter, that's actually a man, I'm the real woman. And then only in the next step, like the man is replaced by a computer. And then like the gender thing cancels out. But to me, it only, it has almost this fable-like quality, as if machines are trying to imitate femininity to be accepted by humans. And that maybe ties into your question from before, where like male,
Why don't we switch to
masculine machines who are characterized as masculine are seen as more threatening. So I don't think that's an explanation, but that might be another interesting story to consider.
It is an interesting story and ties to my, no one has a question, I have two questions. One is, did you look into because with the Turing test and so on, there was a whole discussion about it when Google introduced first the Google Duplex project and all these assistants that are kind of capable of making appointments at the hairdresser or whatever. That is kind of advancing, so it was really revolutionary. So did you look at that? And the second thing is the kids, the children, because there are two things that have happened, and that is with the Mattel releasing Barbie doll with this voice recognition software, and the anecdote where my friend was looking for her, whatever, some kind of document. And so she asked her daughter, like, okay, have you seen mommy's document? And her daughter immediately responded with, hey, Google, where's the document? So it was really funny. So what is the next step in researching all these issues with psychological, like us actually asking machines some things, like confessionaries, basically asking them to give us help, assist us with our emotional grief? And on the other side, the issue of kids getting used to constant surveillance, which we are already kind of going into, but we're resisting, whether this will influence their perception that whatever, if we're surveilled, it will kind of become new normal for them.
I mean, it's on. Perfect. So when it comes to sort of the kids asking, hey Google, I think it's a really interesting question. The author I was quoting before, his sort of really big book, Walter Ong's, is about how sort of our minds and our mental shapes and mental processes changed as we moved from an era of the spoken word to the printed word. And it's incredible, like the definition of the law changed from the word of the most powerful person in the village to something that can be written down. Because previously you had no objective record that this law existed, now you did. So essentially, Walter Ong unfortunately passed away around 2 decades ago, but his book sort of ends up with, this computer thing is going to be really interesting. And I think that sort of what we're starting to see is that all of those devices are beginning to restructure our consciousness, just like the introduction of print once did. It's terrifying, it's unpredictable, it's really cool, and it's sort of the human essence. And I think that one of the things is that when you're in the middle of a revolution, it's very, very difficult to stop and realize what's happening and sort of, what you're losing and what you're gaining. And this is why sort of, the example of the smart toys or even smart TVs. I mean, those are devices with which we share super intimate data, but the funding for like security for Internet of Things is next to non-existent. And we're just talking about security right now. Like, we're not even talking about the bigger like ethical surveillance issues, etc. We're moving at such a breakneck pace that, quite frankly, nobody cares about the security of the Internet of Things. So like, revolutions are always going to be scary. Revolutions are always going to be overwhelming. And we are in the middle of one, and we don't quite know what's happening.
Okay, so on that note, everything's scary, but we're excited about being scary. Sometimes I scared, actually. Sometimes. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned something new and heard some new things, and it made you ponder on what's next in our revolution. And thank you, Polaris and Lukas, and I hope we'll talk more later.
Hello, hello. You hear me? Hello.